Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
We wanted to talk about procrastination today. It's something that many listeners have let us know that they would like to hear an episode on. It's something that I think all three of us have a personal relationship with in one way or another.
As does everyone else.
Yeah, I think it's pretty universal. So we thought we'd try to circumambulate it as we do.
I wonder if we should put it off for another week or two until we feel more prepared.
Let's do that.
Well, at least as you've said, I think pretty much everybody has some experience with procrastination. And what comes up immediately for me, and I think for many other people, is when I have had a writing task, a school assignment, a training assignment, and all kinds of things come up now today as well. And I know that that is the time that I get really, really interested in laundry, particularly, and the importance of doing laundry, because then when that is done, then I can relax and I'll be in the right mood and it won't be nagging at me. And then in my fantasy, I will be ready to sit down and write. And I know, what it is I can do laundry. I feel confident that I can find the dirty clothes, sort them, wash them, dry them, and fold them and put them away. And I'm not always so confident about my ability to hunker down on ideas and ordering and the much more difficult task of writing.
See, at least when you procrastinate, Deb, you do laundry, because I'm afraid that when I procrastinate, I usually find myself on a social media site.
Oh, no.
At least you're being productive.
Well, it's interesting. I think we're talking about anxiety and what we do to discharge anxiety, to distract ourselves with a social media site, to get really busy, because then I can tell myself I'm being very productive. This laundry, or sometimes cleaning the baseboards. I have been known to clean the woodwork, and that then I can tell myself how effective I'm being, and I really am doing work. So there are all kinds of ways that procrastination can delude us and help us avoid facing the necessary task.
I found myself thinking, Deb, when you were talking, that there probably is a valid and somewhat mysterious relationship between the task that we are putting off, the intensity of resistance to it, and the category of things that we do to displace that energy. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, it's one thing to think, I've got to finish my homework. I feel a little irritated about having to do that, and reorganizing the closet seems like something that I'm going to spend my time on. Versus, let's say, some people that have, a really substantial issue. Maybe, I've got to call the doctor to get the diagnosis from the test. And, I'm really frightened. And then instead, I'm going to, drink a bottle of scotch. They're all in that category of doing something else. But somehow it seems commensurate to the amount of dread or the amount of distress that's provoked by the potential behavior, I suppose.
Yeah, so what we're really talking about right at the outset is feelings. That we feel anxious, we feel dread, we may fear we are incompetent, that somehow we are not going to be enough to master or even tackle this task. And so we do something else.
Yeah, there was a great piece actually in the New York Times in March of 2019 about procrastination, and it really just gripped me because I thought, oh man, they've nailed it. There are a couple of psychologists who've been doing some research and some work on procrastination, what they say. In fact, I think that the title of the article is Why You Procrastinate. It has nothing to do with self-control. And we'll link it in the show notes. But what they wind up saying, and I think, it's just right, it's really about avoidance of negative emotion. If you think about it, so just to kind of expand on that a little bit, when you have something that you don't want to do, like schedule a medical test to confirm a fear diagnosis, or write a paper, or, make a phone call that is going to take a long time and be a nuisance, or whatever it is, procrastinating it, getting busy doing laundry or getting on social media or whatever it is you're doing, is a way of avoiding the negative feelings associated with the task. And I think, Joseph, what you were picking up is, the negative feelings can be like, I really don't want to have to call the cable company today. What a nuisance. Versus, oh my God, what if I have colon cancer, right? So it can really kind of run the gamut. This is a strategy, we can think about it, of affect management. So I've got some negative feelings or affects, and I need to figure out how I deal with them. And avoidance is a way of managing feelings. It's not a very adaptive way of managing feelings. It works in the short term. Immediately you feel better when let's say you have a writing deadline coming up and you don't want to do it. It's like, you know what? I'm going to catch up on my Netflix show. I'm going to watch another episode of, whatever right now. And so immediately in the short term, you feel better. It's like, I could just relax and catch up on, the new episode of whatever. But in the long term, obviously, this usually has negative consequences. And again, the negative consequences can be just that the problem doesn't get resolved right away and you wind up, having your cable company issue for another week. Or it can actually be deadly, as in a medical diagnosis that gets put off. But it definitely falls under this category of managing emotions. And this relates to this quote that we've discussed before on the podcast, where Jung says that a neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. So the thing that we use to put off dealing with a difficult emotion, that's the neurosis, like procrastinating, is a way of avoiding the deeper core emotion underneath. For example, in the case of the medical diagnosis, fear. We don't want to suffer the fear of our own mortality. So we kind of create this hysterical avoidance that is neurotic.
I'm kind of paying a lot of attention to what you're saying, and certainly we avoid fear. I think we also avoid shame, that if someone has to do, let's say, a book report or give a presentation, horrors of writing that up and preparing it, evokes that feeling of shame, of what if I do this and I get up in front of everybody in the audience or the classroom and my report isn't good enough and people roll their eyes and I get a bad grade. I'm thinking that we can also avoid commitment and making a decision. Am I or am I not going to go on this job interview or send in a resume or ask somebody out on a date? And as long as I avoid the decision, I have avoided the suffering that comes with choice.
The suffering that comes with choice, and perhaps the fear that we would feel if we went for the job interview, right?
Exactly.
I think you're right. It can be avoidance of any number of things, but there's often an emotion underneath. It might be fear, it might be sadness, it might be anger, it might be shame.
I think that's exactly what we're circumambulating here is it's always an emotion that is being avoided. And then I think sometimes people also procrastinate in order to kind of turn up the heat, that as it gets down to the deadline, then somehow people have this, and studies show that it's a false belief, that then I will just sort of catapult myself into some kind of frenzy, supercharge myself into leaping into the breach just in the nick of time.
Yeah, there is a teenager in my life who insists that this is a productive pattern and that frankly, that argument drives me a little bit batty.
Right, working better under pressure, that fantasy.
No.
Deb, what I was, I know. Deb, what I was thinking about when we were talking earlier about making decisions, and I found myself also thinking about typology, that if we think about Myers-Briggs typology, one of the last indicators is whether you're a judging type J or a perceiving type P. Mm-hmm. And often when I have perceiving types in the consult room, there's an enormous desire to leave everything in an unfolding process and to never come to a conclusion. But that can often look like procrastinating, that they're putting off landing on something solid because of all the innumerable options that then are no longer available to them. And yes, that does cause them a lot of stress, and even more so, it causes people around them stress who need a decision from them. And then they wind up feeling that people are making decisions for them because the system is kind of grinding to a place where it has to move on. But there is a style of personality where thinking over all the possibilities seems to be authentic to a person, even though it can be really costly to them.
Well, in every decision or commitment or act of choice, we have selected what we've selected, and the other options are now gone. They have been lost. And that might be another feeling of the anxiety that comes up about, well, but what about the roads not chosen? You know, in the Robert Frost poem, you have to choose a road. 2 roads diverged. You have to pick one. We cannot have it all. I'm kind of taking the next step in my own head from the feelings involved in procrastination to the question of ego development, ego strength, ego flexibility, and what is adaptive. Mm-hmm. It seems kind of paradoxical that in a way we need a strong, flexible, well-adapted ego in order to say, look, I just have to sit myself down and do this thing, make the phone call, write the report, whatever it is, that there's a certain maybe deficit in ego strength that doesn't allow us to face what is truly difficult.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point because, again, speaking as the mom of teenagers, I do think that in our current culture, a lot is expected of young people in the realm of, let's call it sort of executive functioning, managing deadlines, managing feelings to the point where you can push through avoidance and procrastination. I don't know that those demands are entirely developmentally appropriate. You know, I can see, a lot of kids struggling with having to push through. It is sort of the task of young adulthood, I suppose, to forge that. And yet it does seem like high school students in particular, those that are trying to manage the college application process and a lot of academic demands, the demands put on them may be out of step a little bit with a normal development.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Lisa, of it might pay every parent and every person to think about, wait a minute, am I equipped? Am I ready to face this? Or is it really too much? And that the avoidance may be for very good reason. And at least to explore the legitimacy of, should I be doing this?
There really is a place in the soul where something can rise up and want to suspend a choice or a movement or a decision, because we really do need a kind of developmental field to grow in order to be able to take a really healthy next step versus being forced into something because the culture or the family or something else, has decided for us.
That's such a good point of whether we are being forced into something or whether we have ourselves chosen it. And so it can be maybe a hidden but legitimate protest against something that has been imposed that the person really wishes to refuse or isn't ready for. And I'm also thinking about, when do we need support? Mm-hmm. Somehow I think it's been implicit in this that the individual himself or herself sort of should, quote unquote, be able to, write the report, do the presentation, whatever it is. And maybe we need support. Maybe we need help.
It can be difficult to support a procrastinator. I think one of the points that the psychologist featured in the New York Times article I referenced before make is that really what you need to do is cultivate self-acceptance and self-compassion. That is something that we might be able to do as analysts with someone who's procrastinating. I'll tell you, as a parent, it's difficult to support a procrastinating child in that way.
But talking about the procrastinating child, I feel like there is something at play often around power, which is kind of a different dynamic. And interestingly enough, Freud felt that procrastination was a toilet training issue. Of course, he linked a lot of things to toilet training also. But this battle of wills about accommodating this kind of cultural movement out of diapers into toilets, and also the ability for the young ego to control that instinct to want to poop wherever you are, to monitoring those sensations and then traveling to the toilet, and all of those actually very sophisticated skills when you're asking maybe a 2-year-old to do that. And I have a really funny story. So this is way back when I was living in Charlottesville. This was like in the early 90s, and I lived in a duplex. The family next door, wonderful, wonderful family. Mom had 7 children in 8 years. And they had decided it. Her husband was a resident. It was really a decision. But man, that's a lot of babies to have in one house. And so I wound up just befriending the family. And of course, the kids were all over the place. So, you get absorbed into the community a little bit. So the youngest child, Gabriel, is just, mom is like pulling her hair out because he just won't toilet train. So he and I just had a little bit of a connection. So she's lamenting about this and I'm over. So I just pick up, Gabe, and I whisper into his ears and I cut my hands over his ears and I say, "Why don't you want to use the toilet?" And then he turns and he puts his hands around my ear and he goes, "Because I don't want to." and then I said, "Well, why don't you give it a try?" And he did. And then the next day he was willing to use the toilet, but he had to admit to somebody he wasn't going to have it. He just wasn't going to do it.
That was a very astute analytic intervention that you made.
He was totally knew what he was up to.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, that it's this sort of effort, like, don't make me move out into the world. You know, I'm not going to sign up for the SAT, Mom, no matter how many times you admonish me to. I'm just not going to do it, or whatever it is.
And part of it way down deep is if they were whispering in your ear, it's because I don't want to. And there's a power of ego development in saying no.
Yes.
Although, as in the case of the Gabriel, there wasn't any sense of the consequence or the cost to mom or anything else. He's really just needing to feel his own power in that moment.
But also, besides wanting to feel your own power, what is the I don't want to? And I think some of it is fear of, moving into more independent, like wanting to stay kind of regressed,
On the other hand, I'm thinking about the green eggs and ham. I do not want to, Sam, I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. And that's like in the Gabriel place of ego development of I have to claim my I. I don't want that. I don't want to. Yeah. And we all know that kids and teenagers, and probably all of us, have to be able to claim our power of no. Mm-hmm. Versus what I think you might be alluding to, Lisa, is the refusal of the call to more life and even the hero's journey.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so we have to take a look at what is the no or the procrastination about where is it, as they say, coming from.
So I want to bring in this story from Jung's autobiography that I've written about before, that it's not exactly procrastination, but it is avoidance. And so it's in the same neighborhood, and we can hold dear little Gabriel in our hearts too as I share this story. So this is a story from his boyhood. So when he was 12, he was pushed to the ground by another kid. Apparently he was not very well liked, and he hit his head on the pavement and nearly lost consciousness. And he sort of, in that moment, kind of understood that there was an opportunity here. He says, "At the moment I felt the blow, the thought flashed through my mind, now you won't have to go to school anymore. I was only half unconscious, but I remained lying there a few minutes longer than was strictly necessary, chiefly in order to avenge myself on my assailant." So at that point, he started having fainting spells whenever he went to school or sat down to do his homework. So for 6 months, he didn't go to school, and his parents were like talking to doctors, and I sent him to live with an aunt or something. And Jung remembers, he uses the word, he said it was a picnic, but he also had this idea that something was wrong. And he says, "I frittered away my time with loafing, collecting, reading, and playing, but I did not feel any happier for it. I had the obscure feeling that I was fleeing from myself." It just kind of became the new normal, and it was just as things were. And then something happened, and I'm going to read from there. He says, "Then one day a friend called on my father. They were sitting in the garden, and I hid behind a shrub, for I was possessed of an insatiable curiosity. I heard the visitor saying to my father, 'And how is your son?' 'Ah, that's a sad business,' my father replied. 'The doctors no longer know what is wrong with him. They think it might be epilepsy. It would be dreadful if he were incurable. I have lost what little I had, and what will become of the boy if he cannot earn his own living?' I was thunderstruck. This was the collision with reality. 'Why, then I must get to work,' I thought suddenly. So then he sat down, and he immediately went to his father's office, and he started studying his Latin, and he fainted within a few minutes, but he got back up and he sat down and he kept going. And this time he fainted after, 20 minutes or something, but he got back up and he kept going. And eventually the attack stopped. And he said, I worked for another hour until I had the feeling that I had overcome the attacks. Suddenly I felt better than I had in all the months before. And in fact, the attacks did not recur. From that day on, I worked over my grammar and other school books every day. A few weeks later, I returned to school and never suffered another attack even there. The whole bag of tricks was over and done with. That was when I discovered what a neurosis is."
So procrastination is a neurosis. What struck me in what you read from Jung, which is so clear and such a great story, is the fleeing from reality, that when he was procrastinating, he really was no happier for it. And he knew, something in him knew he was just avoiding, and it was not good for him.
And that you're fleeing from yourself. And I think it's true. I mean, speaking personally, when I say, you know what, I'm not going to work on that, paper that I need to present next month, that feels too much.
What I was thinking about when you were reading this story is, this kind of modern technique of desensitization, that by exposing people to a fundamentally benign stimulus that over distresses them, and they do that over and over again, the nervous system and just the psyche itself recognizes that whatever that is not as threatening as I've made it. So whether it's people are phobic about bees, and so the therapist brings a jar with a bee in it, and they have to sit next to it on the couch, and maybe they'll faint or sweat profusely. And then after a while, the body will finally realize this isn't a true threat and recalibrate itself.
Yeah, so Carl was doing cognitive behavioral therapy on himself.
Actually, there's a lot of stuff that's been taken from Jung and Freud and just repackaged for modern consumption without it being credited properly.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking about this collision with reality too, of, in your example, Joseph, of, sitting next to a jar with a bee in it. of the reality is it's one bee and it's in a jar and it's contained and it is no threat whatsoever. The neurotic reality is, oh my God, it's a bee. I'm in mortal danger. And there may be a real life fear that is at the nexus of this, which is that something terrible happened, a bad bee sting that maybe resulted in some kind of anaphylactic shock episode. But the bee that was then, this is now. The bee in the jar is not a threat. Reality is a big, big teacher here.
Well, although if you have an anaphylactic reaction to bee stings, you should be mortally afraid of bees. But I think your point, Deb, which is important, is most of the time when we're procrastinating, the thing that we're fearing or trying to avoid or putting off is not as bad as we think it is.
Exactly.
And I think, it's like you're procrastinating on loading the dishwasher. Guess what? That's going to take you 3 minutes. Just do it.
And the other mystery around procrastination that I have thought about is how it can be multi-generational, that the distress around a particular event could have happened in dad or granddad's life, and then it becomes a kind of family story that, this is ominous, or this is a terrible thing, or never trust the government, because we emigrated from Soviet Russia and when they became communist, we lost everything. So you must always beware of any kind of government situation or government exercise. But I can think of a story that was, really poignant with a client of mine who had an incredible paralyzing dread of completing his taxes. And, as we had unpacked this in multiple ways, and it was a really just paralyzing dread, what finally began to surface were hidden memories of dad, having gone through a terrible problem with the IRS when he was a young child. And so there was this unconscious field of dread around authority and around a specific task like filing one's taxes. And although that memory had fallen away, the complex that had been inherited by the father was like a ghost, that would rise up, every April 14th and create this enormous amount of dread, which lacked imagery, that it was kind of just a physical state of dread. So some of these things can just get passed down, and it's not even something that we necessarily participated in personally.
That is a really important point, and points for me to parental complexes. In this person's life, it was a father complex of he picked up his father's fear, which happened to be located on the tax forms and from the father's own history. And I was thinking about it could be a mother complex too, and that in the fairy tale we discussed recently of Vasilisa the Beautiful, her mother gave her a little doll that she could put in her pocket, and it would talk to her and give her good advice whenever she needed it. And that maybe some of the procrastination impulse comes from not believing that you have a little doll in your pocket, that you don't have a positive mother complex or father complex, that that is a part of you internally now that will be helpful to you rather than destructive.
So there can be an internal imago, an image, or even a talismanic device. But I think that as culturally, we have a kind of seductive fantasy of radical independence, which, is part of the American pioneering spirit. But there are times where that can also be poisonous, because sometimes we really do need a companion, like a literal companion, to bridge our distress around something we're procrastinating. I'm thinking about this one tax issue. This fellow discovered that if his spouse was actually just puttering in the room while he was doing his taxes, suddenly it would break the spell. And there would be a little more breathing room, a little less unconscious distress. But there's all kinds of intractable moments where if somebody just linked arms with us and walked us across that metaphorical street, we all of a sudden could do a bunch of things. And then through a lived experience, a kind of gestalt, a new gestalt, we suddenly realize, oh, that's not so bad.
Yeah, I think that's really perfect. And I think what you're both talking about is, when I mentioned before that these psychologists had talked about self-acceptance and self-compassion, I think part of the reason is that when we procrastinate, again, immediately it feels good. But right behind that are feelings of shame and like self-recrimination, like, oh, I'm a terrible person. I'm so irresponsible. Why do I always do this? Which only gets you into a sort of self-reinforcing spiral, because then you want to avoid thinking about what a bad person you are for avoiding. So you sort of have to walk that back. And I think you're exactly right, Joseph, that being companioned is tremendously helpful. And that companioning can happen on an outer level, can be really, really helpful. Deb, I think your reference to the little doll is we can also try to cultivate an inner companioning rather than saying, I'm such a terrible person for procrastinating, what the fuck is wrong with me or whatever. We can say, this is really hard for me. I'm really scared about this presentation. And I know I feel afraid to stand up in front of all these people. And so I'm just not wanting to do it. And this is hard. And it would be hard for anyone. And maybe I could be a little gentler with myself. And why don't I try working for 20 minutes? And then maybe I could take a break and, have a cup of tea and then maybe come back to it or something like that.
Yeah, you're pointing to something that I think is important. A couple things. One is that as you guys were talking about this sort of cycle of self-recrimination and so on, I kept thinking of how this is psychological quicksand. And we get in it, and the more we flail around, the worse it gets.
That's a perfect image.
And we might need somebody, as you said, Joseph, to just lend a hand. Just throw me a tree branch that I can hold on to. The other is beginning. If we can begin, as you said, Lisa, spend 20 minutes and then take a break, but just actually do the reality testing for how bad is it really to empty the dishwasher, make the doctor's appointment, write the report. Of getting over that hurdle of beginning can be a really big thing, and the only way to begin is just get it over with, because most of the time it's not as bad as one may fear, and there is support, maybe from a human being, another person, and maybe from something in one's own psyche that will rise up to meet you. You're not alone, or you don't have to be alone.
So there's a way that the task that's being avoided or procrastinated can be reframed through the presence of another person or in other methods so that it doesn't evoke the same amount of negative feeling. And I have another story that comes to mind. A friend of mine many years ago used to live at an ashram in the United States. And, because everyone lived in a community, there was a lot of tasks, and some of the tasks were really onerous. So people would, procrastinate, let's say, garbage duty. And the ashram was large, so they literally had, like a garbage truck, the same kind of trucks that are running down the street. And everybody would show up late, or they wouldn't want to do it, and they'd procrastinate. So the guru, in his wisdom, said, we're going to change this. So they scrubbed down the garbage truck, they painted it all of these psychedelic colors, put big speakers on the side of it, playing kind of transcendental music, and then put everybody in these very zesty psychedelic clothes to do the trash duty. And then suddenly it became the most popular duty that everybody wanted to turn at. So there's a way of also looking at the task and reshaping it while we're still getting the essential process done. But we can change elements around it to evoke different feeling states that I think can all of a sudden clear the way to do something.
I think that is a really great tip. And I'm thinking about Motown, play a little Motown and I'm there. I'll do the garbage truck, empty the dishwasher, vacuum the downstairs, whatever it is, of working with ourselves to do that kind of reframing of what raises my energy, what turns my libido into a forward-moving, effective engagement with something.
Yeah, Deb, your language about sort of forward-moving makes me think of the phrase that you used back a couple minutes ago. You talked about the refusal of the call. And it seems, like we've identified that procrastination is about avoidance and sort of where is the no. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the no is it just seems boring or unappealing. And sometimes the no is a desire to stay in the psychological world of childhood. I'm wondering, if you want to sort of share more about that. I know you had a fairy tale to lift up.
As ever, and we're always doing it on this podcast, there's a story about that. And this one comes from Joseph Campbell, a hero with 1,000 faces. In this tale, there is a prince, and he's a young man, and it's time for him to get married. The story keeps on building, and the prince says no, and the father is distressed, and the prince references lines from various poets to, sort of rationalize his refusal. And his father, the king, goes to a wise man who says, just give him another year. It'll be okay. He's just not ready yet. And a year goes by, and the prince still refuses. And eventually the father gets so frustrated and exasperated that he basically puts him in a dungeon with only a candle and a leather couch or mat to lie on. And there it is. And meanwhile, way across the world, across the continent of Asia, there's a princess in China who is going through the same thing, that she says, no, I won't be any man's wife. And her father basically gets to the same place and imprisons her in a house, and there she remains. So what's the resolution to this dilemma? Well, it's pretty interesting. Campbell says, with the hero and heroine both following the negative way, and between them the continent of Asia, it will require a miracle to consummate the union of this eternally predestined pair. Whence can such a power come to break the life-negating spell and dissolve the wrath of the two childhood fathers? And there it is. That is the big question of whence will come the miracle that will break the spell of the refusal of the call that both these young people have, with marriage being the age-appropriate next stage of development. Let's not literalize it too much.
Right, but just some new stage of development that is being avoided.
Exactly. Despite the wisdom of the king for both this young woman, the princess, and the young prince. So what is a king? King is usually ego, is it not?
Or the kind of predominant cultural attitude, which I think can refer, as I think, Joseph, you were mentioning before, that we have a kind of cultural, sort of negative take on procrastination. It's like a lack of willpower or, an inadequate sense of a work ethic or something. And, that the fact that they wind up in prison in these kind of austere conditions is sort of an image of the inner situation when we're self-flagellating when we're in a sort of, shame spiral over procrastinating. Like we just get more and more upset with ourselves. And finally we sort of stick ourselves in a dungeon. It's like, you idiot, what are you doing? Or whatever,
And it's a perfect image, the dungeon or the imprisonment of we have turned inward on ourselves. And now our psychic space is very small, very meager, very dark. The tale points to this is not a good thing. It's not a moving forward. It's not growth oriented.
In that amplification of the suffering, there's a way in which we're adding layers and layers to the complex. Each time we succumb to the procrastination, there's another set of memories of avoidance, another set of memories of how awful it felt. And these accreting layers create this, carapace around the particular behavior, which, is really makes it more and more difficult. I do want to come back to an idea we talked about very early in our discussion, having to do with building ego strength. And this ability for the ego, whether it's a heroic position where the ego can suffer to achieve a goal, but any of the number of kind of ego strength deficits that any of us can have. And this is where I think some of our, cognitive behavioral colleagues, are developing some good tools, because I think central to a lot of modern therapy is building ego strength and ego strategies. Jung's psychology is very much for the second half of life, when this kind of creative demand comes out, and often the self and the spiritual life of man wants to have a radical redesign. But the first half of life is just a lot about building muscle and becoming capable. One of the resources that I can recommend to people is a book called Changing for Good. And we can put that in the show notes. And it's written by a guy named Prochaska, who's at the front of the field around the psychology of change. Because when we think of procrastination, it's this resistance to taking hold of a new behavior or a new orientation towards any number of different problems. And he's been able to break down in this kind of thinking strategy of what are the attitudinal shifts that are required going from what he called pre-contemplation, or like I'm barely aware of the problem, to actually taking effective action and maintaining effective action. And through his research, he was really breaking down that people have to go through a really specific process to think themselves into a place of action. And that would apply to things that we're procrastinating. So putting on some muscle about how to do this, there's great resources out there, which I think are available to everyone.
That's really nice and helpful. It's doable.
Yeah, and I think framing it as development of ego strength, in our kind of mythopoetic language of depth psychology, we think about that as the hero's task. And that brings us back to Campbell. And Deb, the story that you shared with us is from the section of Campbell's opus that talks about the refusal of the call, which was an early stage in what Campbell identified as the stages of the hero's journey. So that the hero is kind of living comfortably in a normal existence, and then he receives the call to adventure. And then there is often the refusal of the call, which is, hell no, I'm not going to do that. And that in order to embark on the hero's journey, the hero must eventually get over his refusal of the call. And I think that is very much the task of, say, late teenagerhood or early adulthood. And it goes along with this idea of kind of developing ego strength. And it is going to require of us the cultivation of a heroic attitude to push through fear, anxiety, or avoidance that often undergirds procrastination. So we can think about this as, a dragon that needs to be slayed.
And that dragons that are to be slayed require tactics. And in plenty of fairy tales, there's clever ways that dragons are tricked or dragons are subdued. It's rarely just that the hero or the heroine just casts themselves upon the dragon in a screaming rage, that they have to really think through how they're going to solve the problem. So it requires, one, a determination that you're going to solve this problem, and a very strategic way of thinking and even experimenting, because it's not uncommon that the first lunge at the dragon, you lose a foot or you get scarred on half your face in the fairy tale, and then you go back and you heal and you have some wisdom because you were bested, and then it's the next time that you've learned something, and then you really kick ass.
Yeah. I'm thinking so much about these fairy tales and how encouraging they are no, the protagonist, the hero or heroine, doesn't know how to do it. They get lost in the woods. The first time around, the dragon, snaps off a piece of the foot. It's dark. How will I get through this? And so I think the fairy tales tell us over and over again, of just begin, go for it, try it. Just try writing the paper or cleaning the house or whatever else it is that you're putting off.
And I really like that. And I think one of the things we know from Joseph Campbell is once the hero accepts the call, help appears.
Aha.
So if your task that you're avoiding, that you're procrastinating about, be it writing a paper, making a phone call, cleaning the house, if that's a dragon that you need to confront, once you turn toward it, help will appear. And sometimes that's outer help, like Joseph, you were talking about with your client who found that the spouse being present just helped break the spell. But also inner help will appear. The self will constellate some kind of helpful inner energy once we turn toward the dragon that is the difficult task that we're wanting to avoid. And that's the miracle in the story when Campbell says, where's the miracle going to come from? You can't solve it necessarily just with ego. But if your ego can constellate enough heroic energy just to turn toward it, something unexpected will present itself.
We're not supposed to know how to do it before we've done it. We're just supposed to begin.
That's perfect. And I wonder if that's a good place to move on to a dream.
Yeah, perfect is good enough.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
So here's the dream. We have a 28-year-old male who is a technician who submitted this dream. I'm in what looks like a large garage. There is a band playing for maybe 15 people. A man with the mic asks me who I wanted to hear play. I automatically said Anthony Green, who is an artist I haven't listened to since college. He happened to be in the audience, and he got up on stage. The band started playing Dear Child. It's a joyous-sounding song with a lot of energy. A line that repeats is, I've been trying to reach you, but my extension cord won't reach that far. As the band was playing, a bunch of little fires started on the floor and the walls. Everyone, including me, was running around putting out the fires with our bare hands and by stomping. The band kept playing this whole time. The mood was still light and joyous despite the emergency. Most of the fires were out. I saw through a vent in the wall that there was a raging fire in the basement. I looked back up, and the entire room had transformed into a much more industrial and bigger building. It was some kind of modern factory. A woman who worked in this building took me to the stairs to get into the basement so we could put out the fire. She was around my age. We started going down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs was a big, dark tunnel. I started flipping random switches to try and turn the lights on so I could get to the fire. After maybe 10 seconds of failing, The woman ran into the dark toward the fire without saying anything. I woke up. While awake, I listened to the song again and read along with the lyrics. I was in shock when I heard, "Dear sleeper, you could have had the better bed. I loved to watch the way you grew." I felt like my psyche was saying that directly to me. Here he offers a bit of context around the dream. I've had 3 family deaths in less than 2 years. Father, grandmother, and grandfather. And it has made my anxiety the worst it's been in my life. That being said, I have discovered Jung and working through my anxiety, and at this point, I have my anxiety more under control than before the deaths. He comments about the main feelings in the dream. He felt excitement and joy, and then an undertone of urgency and duty. And then he adds just a little bit more personal explanation and says, "Music was important to me from early childhood through college, but I've been neglecting it since I graduated 7 years ago."
Well, I find this dream pretty moving, actually, and I'm struck by the fact that it seems related to some of the themes we were just talking about, actually, about sort of leaving behind avoidance and facing one's fears. I'm struck that the dreamer is 28, which is an age at which we often sort of turn toward adulthood. And this dreamer has also been required to come to terms with a very enormous dragon of death, loss, and mortality recently.
I'm struck at the outset by the band playing a song entitled "Dear Child." And then in the dream, a line is, "I've been trying to reach you, but my extension cord didn't reach that far." Afterward, when he checked the song and listened to it again, he was struck by the lyric, "Dear sleeper, you could have had the better bed. I loved to watch the way you grew." And he says, I felt like Psyche was saying that directly to me. So I'm on of what is Psyche saying here? What do we imagine about that?
Right. And one of the things that maps there for me is this image of going down into the basement. So talking about the hero's journey, part of what the hero needs to be able to do is accept the call to put out the fires and to descend into the underworld to face the frightening thing. And this dreamer has an anima figure who is playing the customary role of the anima, which is a psychopomp into the depths. There is a woman, there is a guide who will accompany him into the depths. Now, he does kind of linger on the precipice, because if I read the dream correctly, he's trying to make sure that he gets the lights on before he's actually going to fling himself into the task. So that's maybe a kind of procrastination. Like, let me see if I can get the lights on. And eventually the anima says, "Yeah, we don't have time for that. Let's go," you know. But I feel like it's a very sort of positive, it's very positively prognostic that he is willing to go into the basement.
I really am following how you have followed the trajectory of this dream, Lisa, and of course find it very moving. That it starts out with all the child imagery, and then he moves into the hero's task, the next stage of development, and commits himself to the descent. But I'm interested in all these little fires. That if this joyful song is playing, a bunch of little fires starts on the wall and the floor. And they're putting out the fires with bare hands and stomping. And the band played on, that iconic image of the band playing while the Titanic sank.
I was curious about the same thing, because I think that the sequence of things in a dream is always interesting. So the fact that the band, or whatever the life force that's evoked in the psyche through the band and or the lyrics or this particular singer, Anthony Green, that it seems to create heat and fire in the psychic environment if we think of things literally, having a fire break out in a entertainment venue is deeply dangerous and would have to be put out. So that's one view of it, but there's also a positive polarity to it, that sometimes old structures do have to be burned down, that they do have to return to ash in order for something different to rise from the ash. So he says that music used to be important to him from early childhood through college, but the music as it's ignited in the psychic environment seems to set a fire in place. I could take this in a couple of different ways. One is the reinvigoration of the love of music creates a kind of passion and even a frustration in the psyche, which is burning its way through the current resistance to being creative, and could, if the fire isn't put out, liberate the person so that they could put their hands back on that creative spirit. They could be released from its resistance. So that's one fantasy that I have, and I question whether or not it's the right thing to have to put all the fires out in terms of the larger psychic environment.
That's really interesting, and I like it, and I think it's a great point, and it's a great sort of illustration of the principle that we always have to evaluate whether the attitude of the dream ego is actually accurate. So the dream ego is very upset, it's kind of reactive to these fires, and no, let me put them out. But Joseph, you're saying, but what might the prospective function of the fires be? Maybe it is time for things to be burned down, or it is good that there's some heat. I do think as an affect image, the image of a room full of little fires that you have to run around stomping on or putting out with your hands, it's a real image of sort of just daily anxiety, isn't it?
I'm also thinking about the difference between all the little fires starting on the floor and the walls that can be sort of stomped out or slapped down as an ego function. And that's what the dream ego is doing. And then all these other people as well as extensions of the dream ego. But where the big fire is in the basement. It's beyond ego, it's below ego. There is the descent, and there is something that ego alone cannot just stomp out. And he has the help of a woman who works in this building, taking him down there. And she says the woman ran in the dark toward the fire without saying anything. So presumably she is acting in the role of a fire eradication agency, but I'm not sure we know that.
Right. We don't know that she's running to the fire to put it out. She might be running to the fire to warm herself. She might be running to the fire to throw some logs on the fire, some logs of procrastination and logs of resistance and logs of stupid attitudes that haven't served the ego very well. There's a lot of things she might throw on that fire.
But that's great. We do know one way or another she's running toward it.
She's interested in it.
Yes.
Yeah, Deb, I think that's these little fires that surface, and then there is the big fire underneath, that there's something burning down below. And it reminds me of this beautiful quote from Jung that I just love. He says, "I have my eye on the central fire, and I am trying to put some mirrors around it to show it to others." So this idea of the central fire, that thing that burns, within all of us, that is, something essential to human nature.
That's lovely.
And when I think of being 28 years old, and the idea that often that's the first surge of kind of independent demand from the psyche often happens in that 28 to 30 years old.
Right.
So often we might discover a deeper, more authentic demand coming out of the psyche. And it's in the basement, so we don't see it immediately, but it begins to show up higher in the personality as multitudes of little crises that seem to constantly put us out of sync with the direction our life is or with our relationships. And we're always stomping out little fires of irritability and conflicts and mishaps. But when we see a kind of pattern of consistent tensions erupting all around our lives, then we have to begin questioning, is there something inside of me that is fundamentally chafing about the direction of the fire, of the direction of the life, and that those little fires are friction points?
Yeah, and I think sort of building on that, one thing we know about this dream is that this dreamer has a lot of psychic energy, right? I mean, there are fires burning. I think that, again, is a positive aspect of the dream. That's what we know. There's something burning.
And often, the early analysts felt that anxiety was the most common reaction to the avoidance of id, that there's something instinctive happening in the basement, and that the ego, when it begins to get a hint of that, starts freaking out. And that's often a sign that something's approaching from the jungle of your unconscious, and you haven't created a conscious relationship to it, and people fret.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's why it's positive that the dreamer is willing to go into the basement. It indicates that ego is open to having a relationship with this, even if he kind of dawdles at the doorstep a little bit, playing with the lights.
Yeah, there's plenty of energy here. And the question is, what do we do with it? What does the dreamer do with it? We can turn fire to our great advantage, or it can kill us.
Well, one of the things he's doing is he's discovered Jung.
Yes.
He says in the context is he's reading. And what I would say to the listeners is, by beginning to read some of the Jungian text, whether we go right to Jung's work or some of his interpreters, we begin to create a model of the psyche. And as we create a model, we begin to differentiate and structure our inner experience so that we can have a relationship to it. And it sounds like he's beginning to do that process. And he says his anxiety is reduced substantially, even to a point that he has more control than even before these family losses happened. So he's really got his hands in something juicy, something really helpful for himself.
Right. And Joseph, I think the point you brought up, which I thought was so great, about anxiety being sort of secondary to something coming up from the unconscious, or anxiety even as a way of avoiding something that's coming up from the unconscious, like emotions that are difficult. He's not really doing that, right? He's facing into it, and we know that from the dream image, but also because you say that he's working through his anxiety, he's reading Jung. And so, of course, the anxiety is reduced because he's no longer in avoidance mode.
Right. And so the dream, because dreams often compensate, he may have been not quite willing to go into the basement and grab the fire prior to the dream. And so the dream is giving him a little kick in the keister of, what it might be like symbolically to have the courage to go deeper and not just stamp out little fires at the surface of the personality, but really, let's go in the basement. Let's go deeper down in the psyche.
Let's go there.
Let's go there. Let's slap down.
The thing with the lights, though, what strikes me about that is it's almost like maybe a little bit too much ego down in the basement, like too much thinking, like wanting to bring the light of consciousness rather than just experience it. Perhaps, I'm just going out on a little bit of an intuitive limb, but that would be one thought.
Yeah, the electrical, automatic, culturally determined light of electricity versus the light and the heat of the fire. Turning on the lights is not going to help.
I think the dreamer has had a relationship with this music, obviously, and with these particular lyrics, and feels that the psyche landed on this particular song to kind of convey a message, which is something that we can find, right? Sometimes, a little snippet of a song plays in your unconscious, and when you think, sort of just why did I think of that song? And then you think about the lyrics and you realize it is like a message from the unconscious. So what's lovely here is clearly there is some kind of companioning from the unconscious. And again, that feels positive.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the song that played of Dear Child in the context of his losses of grandparents and his father. What a big hit that is for a young person to lose the elders and to lose the support and to lose their help in guiding you out into the larger world.
Thank goodness there is some inner help.
There is inner help, and as I'm looking over the lyrics, there's a recurrent theme in them of trying to reach someone, or two people trying to reach each other, but the extension cord won't reach that far, won't reach that far, reach that far. So whether it's the extension cord between the dreamer and the deceased family members, and there has to be this admission that someone really has died, and this has to be grieved fully, rather than some fantasy of, I don't know, like phone calls between us and the spirit world, that there's a demand to accept the limits and the new reality. And also there's something about this phone call between the inner child and the songmaker. So whether it's a phone call to the deceased or a phone call to more childlike attitudes or childish attitudes, that either way, this yearning to reach and hold and not let go of something that it may be time for it to go. It may be time to surrender it into the fire. And the thing that we're surrendering is the fantasies that don't serve us anymore, longings that can't be realized, any number of young fantasies which have to be abandoned as we move through our 20s into our 30s and all the demands of establishing ourselves in the world. And in that way, it's a fire of sacrifice.
That's beautiful.
That's lovely.
And that seems like an okay place to stop.
Yes.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.